What if the story we inherited was not the first story ever told about mankind, long before the pages of the Bible were copied by scribes? Long before temples rose in Jerusalem, long before prophets spoke of beginnings and endings, there was another land where human beings were already asking the same quiet questions. Who are we? Why are we here? Who placed us beneath the sky, between hunger and hope, between dust and the dream of eternity? That land was Mesopotamia, the ancient world between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Its name means the land between rivers, but it was more than a place on a map. It was a cradle of cities, kings, temples, laws, writing, astronomy, and stories that reached deep into the mystery of human existence. In its mud-brick streets and temple courtyards, people looked at the same moon we see tonight, and wondered whether the heavens were watching them back. Mesopotamia did not remember mankind as a simple beginning. Its stories were crowded with divine beings, restless gods, sacred duties, forgotten floods, and humans shaped for reasons that were not always comforting. In these older tales, creation was not always soft or peaceful. It could feel heavy, practical, and strange, as if human life had been placed into the world to serve a purpose written somewhere beyond human understanding. And this is where the mystery begins to breathe. Because when we look back into Mesopotamia, we do not find empty ruins. We find voices. Broken, incomplete, weathered, but still speaking. These voices tell of gods who argued, of kings who ruled with divine approval, of floods that nearly erased the world, and of mankind standing at the centre of a cosmic drama it did not fully control. For many people today, the story of mankind begins with familiar sacred words. But Mesopotamia invites us to step into an older room, one dimly lit by oil lamps and filled with clay tablets. It asks us to listen before the later stories were shaped, before names changed, before meanings were refined, before one tradition became the version most remembered. This does not mean every answer is hidden there. Ancient texts rarely give themselves so easily. They whisper more than they explain. They open doors, then leave us standing at the threshold. But perhaps that is why they still matter. Because the oldest stories are not only about the past, they are about the part of us that still wants to know whether mankind was an accident, a creation, a servant, a beloved creature, or something more complicated than any single story can hold. So before we search for answers, we slow down and enter that older silence, where the first cities dreamed, the first scribes carved signs into clay, and mankind's beginning was remembered in a way that feels both distant and strangely close, like a memory buried under another memory, still breathing tonight quietly. The stories of Mesopotamia survived in one of the most fragile materials imaginable, clay. Not gold, not marble, not monuments carved into mountains. The memories of entire civilizations were pressed into wet earth by human hands, then left to dry beneath the same sun that burned over ancient rivers thousands of years ago. At first glance, these tablets seem almost unimpressive. Small fragments, broken corners, faded marks shaped like tiny wedges. Yet inside them rests a world that refused to vanish. The people of Mesopotamia wrote in cuneiform, one of humanity's earliest writing systems. Scribes would sit quietly with reed styluses and press symbols into soft clay while kings ruled, merchants traded, priests prayed, and ordinary people tried to survive beneath uncertain skies. They recorded laws, prayers, taxes, poems, myths, arguments, dreams, and warnings. Some tablets spoke of daily life. Others carried stories so old that even the scribes themselves may have copied them from traditions already ancient in their own time. This is what makes the tablets feel almost unsettling. They are not modern inventions. or theories imagined centuries later. They are physical objects created by people who lived close to the dawn of organized civilization. Human hands touched them before many of the world's major religions even existed, and somehow, against floods, wars, collapsing empires, desert winds, and the slow violence of time, thousands survived. Many were buried beneath ruined cities for centuries. Others were shattered and scattered beneath layers of dust. Archaeologists uncovered them piece by piece from places like Nineveh, and Nippur. Often without realizing immediately what they had found, entire libraries emerged from the earth, like forgotten memories returning to consciousness. Some tablets were damaged by fire, yet the fire itself preserved them by hardening the clay. There is something strangely poetic about that. Destruction became preservation. Collapse became survival. And when scholars finally learned how to read cuneiform in the modern age, the silence began to break. Stories emerged about creation, divine councils, sacred gardens, heavenly judgment, immortal quests, and floods sent to destroy humanity. Themes that sounded unexpectedly familiar began appearing from civilizations far older than most people imagined. For a moment, it felt as though history itself had shifted slightly beneath the human mind. Because these tablets suggested that many ideas believed to belong to later traditions may have existed in another form long before. Not identical, not simple copies, but echoes carried through time, changing shape as civilizations rose and disappeared. The clay tablets remain quiet even now. They do not force conclusions. They simply endure, waiting in museums, archives, and ruins, holding fragments of mankind's oldest Vresoven, surviving conversations with itself, and perhaps with something beyond itself as well. Each broken fragment feels less like an artifact and more like a survivor, carrying the strange weight of having crossed thousands of years, simply to reach human eyes that were never supposed to see it again fully. As the clay tablets slowly revealed their contents to the modern world, another realization began to emerge from beneath the dust. Some of the themes hidden inside these ancient writings sounded deeply familiar. There were stories about creation, stories about humanity being formed from earth, stories about divine beings shaping human destiny, stories about sacred gardens, heavenly councils, catastrophic floods, chosen survivors, and the uneasy relationship between mankind and the powers above it. Yet many of these texts came from civilizations that existed long before the earliest biblical writings were compiled. At the center of this older world stood Sumer. Sumer was one of the earliest known civilizations in human history, rising in southern Mesopotamia thousands of years ago. Its cities, like Uruk, Eridu, and Ur, appeared during a time when much of humanity still lived in smaller settlements. The Sumerians built temples that reached toward the heavens, developed systems of writing, organized large societies, and preserved myths that would echo far beyond their own age. To the people of Sumer, the universe was alive with divine presence. Gods were not distant figures hidden beyond existence. They governed storms, rivers, fertility, wisdom, kingship, and fate itself. Human beings lived beneath their authority, surrounded by signs of cosmic order and cosmic danger. And within that world, certain stories begin to feel strangely recognizable. There are accounts of humanity being shaped from clay, tales of paradise-like places tied to divine order, narratives about great floods sent to erase civilization, figures chosen to survive destruction, while others disappear beneath rising waters. Even the idea that mankind exists under moral or spiritual responsibility appears long before many expect it to. None of this automatically proves that one tradition copied another. Ancient history is rarely that simple. Stories travel, transform, merge, and survive in fragments. Cultures borrow images from one another, but they also reshape those images according to new beliefs and fears. What matters is not forcing certainty where certainty may never exist. What matters is recognizing that the roots of human storytelling may reach deeper into the past than most people realize. And perhaps that is what makes Mesopotamia so fascinating. It feels less like discovering a forgotten civilization, and more like uncovering an older layer beneath familiar ideas. A layer where the human mind was already wrestling with mortality, creation, obedience, chaos, divine power, and the fear that civilization itself could vanish overnight. The further we move into these ancient stories, the stranger the experience becomes. Familiar patterns begin appearing in unfamiliar forms, like seeing reflections in dark water. The names are different, the details shift, the meanings evolve. Yet something underneath remains hauntingly recognizable. It leaves us with a quiet question that becomes harder to ignore. If so many of these ideas already existed in Mesopotamia long before later sacred texts took shape, then what exactly was being remembered across the centuries? And how far back does that memory truly go? Beyond even the first cities and kings, humanity thought it knew completely. The reason these older stories still pull at the human mind is not only because they are ancient. Age alone does not create mystery. Many things are old, yet they do not follow us into the night, or stay with us after the screen goes dark. Mesopotamia feels different because its stories touch questions that have never really left us. Every generation wants to know where it came from, not only in the biological sense, but in the deeper sense. We want to know whether human life has meaning, whether suffering has a reason, whether death is an ending or a doorway, whether the universe is silent or filled with intention. These questions do not belong to one religion, one culture, or one time. They belong to mankind itself. That is why a broken tablet from a vanished city can still feel strangely personal. When the people of Mesopotamia wrote about creation, they were not only explaining the beginning of the world. They were trying to understand their place inside it. When they wrote about floods, they were not only remembering water, they were facing the terror of being erased. When they wrote about gods and kings, they were asking why power exists, why some command while others obey, and whether human life unfolds freely or under forces too large to see. These are not dead questions. A person lying awake at night may never think of ancient Sumer, but the same uncertainty can still rise quietly in the mind. Why am I here? What am I meant to do? Why does life feel both meaningful and fragile? Why does the world seem organized, yet so easily broken? Ancient people ask these questions beneath temple towers and star-filled skies. Modern people ask them beneath electric lights, in quiet rooms, while the world outside keeps moving. The setting has changed, but the ache remains. This is why Mesopotamia matters. It offers more than older versions of familiar stories. It offers a different emotional map of mankind. In this map, humans are not always the centre of divine love or the final purpose of creation. Sometimes they are workers, sometimes servants, sometimes noisy, fragile beings watched by powers that do not fully explain themselves. And yet, even inside that heavier vision, human beings still search, build, pray, write, remember, and hope. There is something deeply moving about that. The people who pressed these stories into clay are gone. Their cities fell, their gods changed names or disappeared from worship, their rivers shifted, their temples collapsed, their languages became silent. But their questions survived. And perhaps that is the real reason we keep returning to them. Mesopotamia does not simply ask where mankind came from. It asks why mankind was made at all. That question waits beneath every creation story, like a shadow behind the first morning. By the time the first cities rose from the plains of Mesopotamia, the world was already imagined as a place filled with unseen powers. The rivers that fed the land could also destroy it. Storms appeared without warning. Crops grew, then failed. Disease arrived suddenly. The stars moved in patterns nobody fully understood. To the people living in that ancient world, existence did not feel random or empty. It felt inhabited. The gods of Mesopotamia were not distant creators who simply formed the world and stepped away from it. They were deeply involved in earthly life. They ruled over rivers, storms, fertility, war, wisdom, love, and kingship. Entire cities belonged to particular gods, and each temple was treated as a living house where divine presence rested among humanity. This made the universe feel crowded with intention. In later religious traditions, people often imagine a cleaner structure. One supreme force, one moral center, one divine authority standing above creation. But Mesopotamian mythology moved differently. Its heavens were layered with competing personalities, divine families, rivalries, negotiations, anger, and shifting balances of power. The gods argued with one another. They grew frustrated. They made decisions together, then regretted them later. Sometimes they protected humanity. Sometimes they feared it. Sometimes they simply used it. To modern ears, this can sound strangely human, and perhaps that is why these stories feel so alive even now. The gods of Mesopotamia were not abstract ideas floating beyond emotion. They behaved like rulers, judges, workers, parents, warriors, and kings. They held authority, but they also carried desire, pride, jealousy, exhaustion, and uncertainty. Divine life mirrored human society, and human society mirrored divine life. This connection shaped everything. Kings ruled because divine order allowed them to rule. Priests performed rituals because harmony between gods and mankind needed constant maintenance. Farmers depended on favourable seasons because nature itself reflected the moods and balance of unseen powers. In many ways, Mesopotamian civilization operated like an extension of the heavens. Even creation itself unfolded inside this larger cosmic structure. Human beings were not placed into a peaceful paradise and left alone to flourish. Instead, they entered a world already occupied by divine systems, obligations, and hierarchies. The universe existed before them, governed by powers with their own concerns and conflicts. Humanity arrived afterward, stepping into a reality that did not revolve entirely around human happiness. There is something both unsettling and fascinating about this older worldview. It suggests that existence may not have begun as a gift prepared solely for mankind. It may have begun as a vast order already in motion, where humans inherited duties along with consciousness itself. In Mesopotamian myth, people are often connected to labour, service, ritual, and maintenance. The relationship between gods and humanity feels less like simple affection and more like dependence, woven together with authority. And yet, despite this heavy structure, humans continued searching for meaning inside it. They built cities beneath the gaze of gods. They studied the stars. They composed hymns and myths. They asked questions about mortality and destiny that still feel familiar today. The Mesopotamian universe was crowded, unpredictable, and sometimes harsh, but it was never empty. Every storm, river, dream, and kingdom seemed connected to forces beyond ordinary sight. And within that ancient atmosphere, a different story of human creation slowly began to take shape beneath the weight of divine necessity and cosmic order itself. In many modern creation stories, humanity is imagined as the center of divine attention. The world is prepared first, then people arrive as its caretakers, children or chosen beings. There is often beauty in these beginnings. Light separated from darkness. Gardens filled with abundance. creation unfolding with intention and order. But some Mesopotamian stories move in a far more unsettling direction. In certain ancient myths, the gods themselves were burdened by labour before humanity even existed. Lower-ranking divine beings were said to work endlessly, digging canals, shaping the land, maintaining the systems that allowed civilization and an agriculture to survive. The universe did not begin in rest. It began in exhaustion. Over time, according to these stories, the lesser gods grew tired of their endless duties. They rebelled against the weight placed upon them, in some versions surrounded. They surrounded the dwelling of a higher god during the night, demanding relief from their labour. This moment feels surprisingly human. Even divine beings in these ancient narratives could become weary of obligation. And it is here that mankind enters the story. Human beings were created, at least in part, to carry the burden the gods no longer wished to bear. The logic behind creation suddenly changes. Humanity is not simply formed out of love, companionship, or divine generosity. Humanity becomes a solution, a workforce, a replacement. For many modern listeners, this idea creates an immediate tension deep in the mind. What does it mean if mankind was created for labour? What does it mean if civilization itself began as a transfer of responsibility from gods to humans? The Mesopotamian imagination forces these questions quietly into the open. It presents a world where existence comes tied to duty from the very beginning. And, strangely, this ancient idea still feels familiar. People wake before sunrise, work under systems they did not create, build structures larger than themselves, and spend much of life carrying responsibilities that never fully disappear. Across thousands of years, the emotional weight of labour remains deeply connected to human identity. The Mesopotamian myths seem to recognise this truth with uncomfortable honesty. In these stories, work is not a punishment that arrives later. It is woven directly into the reason humanity exists. Yet the myths do not present this in a simple or hopeless way. Human beings are still special in certain respects. They think, speak, create, worship, and remember. They stand between the earthly and the divine, but their existence unfolds within a cosmic structure already shaped by necessity and hierarchy. This creates a very different emotional atmosphere from the idea of paradise. The world of Mesopotamia is beautiful but heavy, sacred but demanding. Humanity enters existence carrying obligations before it even understands itself. The rivers must be managed, the temples maintained, the gods honoured, civilization preserved against chaos. And beneath all of this rests a deeper question that the ancient texts never completely resolve. Were humans truly created because the gods cared for them? Or because the gods needed something from them? Perhaps the answer was never fully clear, even to the people telling these stories. That uncertainty may be part of why the myths survived. They reflect a feeling many humans still carry today. The quiet suspicion that existence itself came with responsibilities attached, long before anyone asked whether they wanted them. If mankind was created to carry a burden, then the next question becomes even stranger. What kind of being had to be made for such a task? In Mesopotamian creation stories, humanity is often shaped from materials that seem simple at first, but become mysterious the longer we sit with them. Clay appears again and again as the substance of human formation. It was everywhere in the ancient riverlands. People built homes from it, shaped tablets from it, sealed contracts with it, and buried their dead beneath the same earth from which life seemed to rise. Clay was ordinary, yet deeply symbolic. It could be moulded when wet, hardened by fire, broken by force, and preserved by chance. It was humble, but it held memory. A tablet of clay could carry a king's command or a sacred myth across thousands of years. So, when ancient people imagined humans being shaped from clay, they were not only thinking of dirt, they were thinking of material that could receive form, hold meaning, and still remain fragile. But clay alone was not always enough. Some Mesopotamian myths speak of humanity being mixed with something divine, something taken from a god. Blood, flesh, or sacred essence enters the creation of mankind, turning the human being into more than earth alone. This detail gives the story a strange power. Humans are lowly and mortal, yet marked by something from beyond themselves. They belong to the ground, but they are not only ground. This is one of the most haunting ideas in ancient creation. Mankind is formed from a mixture, part soil, part spirit, part servant, part sacred vessel, part temporary creature, part bearer of divine memory. It explains why human beings can be weak and powerful at the same time, why they can suffer like animals yet dream of eternity, why they can work in dust and still look upward at the stars. There is a quiet beauty in that contradiction. The Mesopotamian image does not make humanity purely noble, but it does not make humanity worthless either. It places people in between. Not gods, not beasts, not mere tools, not fully free from duty. Something mixed, something unfinished. And perhaps that is why the image continues to feel alive. Every person knows the feeling of being pulled in two directions. The body gets tired, hungry, frightened, and old, yet the mind asks questions that seem too large for the body. It imagines forever. It remembers the dead. It seeks justice, beauty, love, and meaning. Ancient Mesopotamia captured this tension through creation itself. Maybe clay explained our weakness. Maybe divine essence explained our longing. Still, the mystery remains open. Were these stories poetic symbols, describing the human condition through sacred language? Were they memories of older rituals, shaped by temple traditions and priestly imagination? Or did ancient people believe they were preserving something real about mankind's origin, something passed down from a time already ancient to them? The tablets do not answer completely. They simply leave the image before us, a human shaped from earth, touched by the divine, placed into a world of work, worship, and uncertainty. A creature made low enough to kneel in dust, yet high enough to wonder who placed it there. By now, the Mesopotamian story begins to feel strangely close to stories many people already know. A human formed from clay, a divine decision behind mankind's existence, a world arranged with order, responsibility, and unseen authority. A life that begins not in randomness, but in relationship to powers beyond the human mind. And yet, the feeling is not exactly the same. In later traditions, creation often carries a more direct moral shape. Human beings are placed within a world that reflects divine intention, and their choices become part of a sacred drama involving obedience, temptation, loss, judgment, and hope. Mesopotamia gives us something older in tone. Its world feels more crowded, more practical, more politically divine. Humans are created, but they are also assigned. They are valued, but also managed. They are sacred in material, yet tied to labour from the beginning. This difference matters, because the Mesopotamian version does not simply ask where humans came from. It asks what humans were needed for. The human being is not only a mystery of origin, but a mystery of function. Why make such a creature? Why give clay the ability to speak? Why place divine essence inside a mortal body that will suffer, age, and die? These are questions that move quietly beneath the surface of the old myths. The overlap with later biblical themes can feel almost haunting. The clay, the divine breath or essence, the ordering of the world, the burden of human work, the awareness that mankind lives under a command it did not invent. But the meanings shift depending on the world telling the story. One culture may see human life as covenant, Another may see it as service. Another may see it as both, woven together in a pattern too old to separate. Perhaps ancient stories are like rivers. They begin somewhere high and hidden, then flow into different lands, gathering new names, colours, and meanings along the way. By the time we encounter them, they may no longer look like the source, yet something of the source still moves inside them. This is why Mesopotamia cannot be dismissed as a simple background note. It stands near the beginning of written memory, holding versions of mankind's origin that seem both foreign and familiar. Its creation stories feel less like answers carved in stone and more like fragments of a conversation that later civilizations continued in different languages. And maybe that is the deeper fascination. When we compare these traditions, we are not only comparing texts. We are watching the human mind return again and again to the same wound. Why are we here? Who shaped us? Why must we work? Why do we carry both weakness and longing? Why does the earth feel like home and exile at the same time? Mesopotamia's answer is not gentle, but it is powerful. Humanity was shaped from humble material, touched by divine substance, and placed into a world of duty. Familiar, yet different. Ancient, yet still alive. And as we move from creation into the beings who shaped this order, the question becomes even more mysterious. Who exactly were the powers standing behind mankind's beginning? As the creation stories of Mesopotamia unfold, certain names begin appearing again and again beneath the surface of the myths. Names connected with judgment, authority, destiny, and the ordering of the cosmos itself. Among the most mysterious of these names is one that continues to echo through discussions of ancient history even today. The Anunnaki. To modern audiences, the word often arrives surrounded by speculation and dramatic theories. Over time it has been pulled into stories about lost civilizations, hidden knowledge, and beings descending from the stars. But in the oldest Mesopotamian texts, the Anunnaki appear in a quieter and more complex way. They were powerful divine figures connected to the structure of the universe, and the balance of earthly life. Their exact role changes across different periods and traditions. This is important to remember. Mesopotamian civilization lasted for thousands of years, and its beliefs evolved constantly. Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians and Assyrians all inherited older myths while reshaping them according to their own worldviews. Because of this, the Anunnaki were never described in only one fixed way. Sometimes they appear as high-ranking divine beings tied to heaven and authority. Sometimes they are associated with the underworld and judgment. In other texts, they seem connected to the decisions that shape human destiny itself. They are often presented less as individual personalities, and more as a collective power woven into cosmic order. And perhaps that is what makes them feel so intriguing. The Anunnaki exist at the edge of clarity. They are visible enough to leave an impression, yet distant enough to remain mysterious. Ancient scribes wrote about them with familiarity, as though their existence belonged naturally within the structure of reality. There is no dramatic explanation introducing them. The texts often speak as if everyone already understood who they were. That feeling creates an unusual effect for modern readers. It is like stepping into the middle of a conversation that began long before we arrived. We encounter fragments of a larger worldview already fully alive in the minds of ancient people. The Anunnaki are part of that older atmosphere, where divine beings governed not only nature, but social order, kingship, labour, and fate. Their connection to humanity is especially fascinating. Mesopotamian myths often suggest that human civilization exists within systems shaped by divine authority. Cities rise beneath sacred approval. Kings rule through heavenly legitimacy, rituals maintain balance between the mortal and divine worlds. Humanity does not stand outside cosmic order. It functions inside it. In this sense, the Anunnaki represent more than mythological characters. They symbolize the idea that unseen powers structure reality itself. Whether those powers are interpreted spiritually, symbolically, politically, or psychologically depends on the person reading the texts. The ancient world rarely separated those categories as clearly as modern minds do, and so the mystery remains open. Were the Anunnaki simply gods in the traditional sense? Were they symbolic reflections of kingship and power? Were they ancient attempts to explain forces humans could not control? Or were they remembered as something more real to the people who carved their names into clay thousands of years ago? The old tablets never fully resolve the question. They simply preserve the presence of beings who stood above humanity, watching over a world where creation, labour, kingship, and destiny were all deeply connected beneath the gaze of powers older than memory itself. In the world of ancient Mesopotamia, power was never seen as entirely human. Every kingdom, every city wall, every temple tower existed beneath a larger order that people believed came from above. The gods ruled the cosmos, and human society was expected to reflect that divine structure as closely as possible. This belief shaped everything. A king was not merely a political leader. He stood between heaven and earth, acting as a mediator between divine authority and ordinary people. His power depended on sacred approval. Victories in war, successful harvests, peaceful steers, and peaceful cities were all interpreted as signs that harmony still existed between the gods and the human world. When that harmony failed, fear spread quickly. Floods, famine, invasion, disease, or rebellion could be understood as evidence that divine balance had been disturbed. Rituals became essential, not simply as acts of worship, but as acts of maintenance. Priests performed ceremonies, offered sacrifices, read omens, interpreted dreams, and watched the stars because civilization itself was believed to depend on proper alignment between mankind and the unseen powers governing existence. This is where the relationship between the gods and humanity becomes especially revealing. Mesopotamian civilization often feels less like a society built freely by humans, and more like a system carefully administered beneath divine supervision. Temples stood at the centre of city life, not at the edges. Economic activity, agriculture, law, religion, and kingship all flowed through sacred institutions. The gods were not distant figures remembered only during prayer. They were woven into administration, labour, politics, and survival itself. In many ways, the city became a reflection of heaven. The temple belonged to the city's patron deity. Priests managed resources connected to divine service. Kings expanded walls and irrigation systems in the name of sacred order. Even writing itself developed partly through the need to organize offerings, trade, and temple economies. Civilization grew alongside the belief that humans existed within a structure larger than themselves. And within this structure, mankind appears to carry a role that feels both practical and spiritual. People worked the fields, maintained canals, raised monuments, stored grain, paid tribute, and performed rituals that honoured divine authority. The boundary between earthly duty and sacred duty was thin. Labour itself could become part of cosmic order. To serve the city was, in some sense, to serve the gods connected to the city. This creates an unsettling but fascinating question. Did ancient people view civilization as humanity's great achievement, or as humanity's assigned responsibility? The answer may be both. Mesopotamian society produced astonishing developments in architecture, mathematics, astronomy, law, and literature. Yet beneath these achievements remained the feeling that human beings were caretakers inside a system they did not fully control. The rivers could still flood, kingdoms could still collapse, the gods could still withdraw favour. And perhaps that is why so much effort went into maintaining order. The city was not merely a place to live. It was a fragile barrier against chaos. Every wall, ritual, and law stood against forces that ancient people believed were always waiting beyond the edges of civilization. In this world, the Anunnaki and other divine powers were not distant myths. They formed part of the invisible architecture holding reality together, while mankind laboured within that structure, building civilizations that may have served divine order as much as human ambition. The deeper we move into the Mesopotamian view of existence, the more a quiet tension begins to appear beneath everything else. Human beings build cities, create laws, raise families, write poems, and dream of greatness. Yet at the same time, they seem bound to forces beyond their control from the moment they are created. This tension sits at the centre of many ancient myths. The gods establish order, kings rule under divine approval, priests interpret heavenly signs, fate itself appears woven into the structure of reality. Even disasters carry meaning within a cosmic system. To live in Mesopotamia was often to feel surrounded by powers larger than human will, and still, people continued making choices inside that world. This creates one of the oldest philosophical questions humanity has ever faced. Were humans truly free, or were they fulfilling roles already assigned to them? The Mesopotamian answer was rarely simple. Ancient texts often describe destiny as something real and unavoidable. Certain kings are chosen. Certain cities rise while others fall. Omens are studied because the future is believed to leave traces before it arrives. The movements of stars, eclipses, dreams, storms, and strange events could all be interpreted as messages about what was coming. To modern minds, this may sound fatalistic, but for ancient people, it reflected the feeling that existence itself followed hidden patterns. Human beings could act, but they acted within boundaries already shaped by divine order, mortality, and fate. A farmer could plant carefully and still lose everything to floodwaters. A king could build mighty walls and still watch his empire collapse. Even wisdom had limits. The future never fully belonged to humanity. There is something strangely familiar about this feeling. Modern life often speaks the language of freedom, yet people still wake each day inside systems they did not choose. They inherit nations, economies, expectations, and responsibilities long before understanding them. Time moves in one direction. Bodies age without permission. Death remains unavoidable. Beneath modern confidence, the ancient tensions still survives. Mesopotamian myths recognize that tension openly. Humans appear powerful compared to animals, yet fragile compared to gods. They possess intelligence, creativity, and memory, yet remain tied to labor and mortality. They seek permanence while living temporary lives. In many stories, mankind exists somewhere between dignity and limitation, carrying enough awareness to question existence, but not enough control to escape it. This may be why ancient people focused so heavily on ritual, law, and cosmic harmony. If life unfolded inside a larger structure, then survival depended on understanding one's place within it. Obedience to sacred order was not merely religious devotion. It was a strategy against chaos. And yet there are moments in the myths where humans resist, question, search, or seek wisdom beyond their assigned place. That detail matters. Even within systems shaped by divine authority, the human spirit continues reaching outward. People still ask forbidden questions. They still seek immortality. They still dream of meaning greater than labour, alone. Perhaps that is the true paradox at the centre of these stories. Mankind may have been created with a role, yet humans constantly search for something beyond that role. They obey systems while secretly wondering who designed them. They work beneath fate while imagining freedom. And somewhere inside that tension, ancient Mesopotamia begins to feel less like a dead civilization and more like a mirror quietly reflecting the same uncertainty. Humanity still carries today within itself. At first, creation sounds like a beautiful idea. To be created means to exist intentionally rather than accidentally. It suggests meaning, purpose, and connection to something greater than chaos. Most human beings at some point in life feel drawn toward that comfort. The thought that existence matters is deeply reassuring, but the Mesopotamian imagination introduces another side to creation, one that feels heavier the longer we sit with it, because if something is created, then it may also belong to the one who created it. This changes the emotional shape of the question entirely. Human life no longer appears fully independent. It becomes tied to intention, expectation, and responsibility. In many Mesopotamian stories, mankind does not emerge freely from nature. Humans are formed deliberately inside a cosmic structure already governed by divine authority. Their existence begins with obligation attached to it, and perhaps this is why ancient myths often carry such weight beneath their surface. Creation is not simply an origin story, it becomes a condition. To be made means to inherit limits, mortality, labour, duty, dependence on powers beyond oneself. Human beings arrive in a world already ordered by forces they did not choose and cannot fully escape. The old Mesopotamian stories rarely soften this reality. Humans work because the world demands work. They worship because divine balance must be maintained. They fear floods, famine, disease, and judgment, because existence itself feels unstable beneath the surface. Even kings, despite their immense power, remain vulnerable to fate and divine will. No one stands completely outside the structure. Yet, within this burden lies something strangely profound. The same myths that emphasize human limitation also show humanity searching constantly for meaning beyond survival. People build monuments designed to outlast death. They write poems about immortality. They seek wisdom from gods. They preserve stories for generations they will never meet. Even while carrying the weight of mortality, humans continue reaching toward permanence. It is almost as though mankind senses something unfinished within itself. Perhaps that feeling comes from the mixture described in the creation myths: clay and divine essence, earth and longing. Human beings belong to the material world, yet they seem unable to stop searching for what lies beyond it. They carry duties like servants, but questions like philosophers. They suffer like fragile creatures, yet dream like something far older. This contradiction gives Mesopotamian mythology much of its emotional power. The ancient stories do not portray humans as purely cursed or purely blessed. They portray them as burdened, conscious enough to recognize suffering, but not powerful enough to escape it completely, aware of death, yet unable to stop imagining eternity. Created for a role, yet restless inside that role. And this may explain why the myths still feel alive after thousands of years. The hidden weight of being created has never disappeared from the human mind. People still wonder whether their lives are self-directed or shaped by forces larger than themselves. They still ask whether purpose is freedom or responsibility. They still search for meaning while carrying obligations they never chose. So the question left behind by Mesopotamia becomes deeply personal. If mankind was created for a task, then who defined that task? And if the answer lies beyond human control, What does that mean for the strange, restless consciousness living inside every person who continues asking why they were brought into existence at all, long before flood stories became sacred memories in later traditions? The people of Mesopotamia already lived beneath the constant shadow of water. Their civilization depended on rivers. Yet those same rivers could become instruments of destruction without warning. The Tigris and Euphrates gave life to the land, feeding crops, sustaining cities, and making large settlements possible. But they also carried danger hidden beneath their calm surfaces. A season of rising waters could erase entire communities. To modern people, floods are often understood through weather reports, maps, and scientific explanations. Ancient Mesopotamians experienced them differently. Water was not merely a natural force, it felt alive with divine power. Rivers could nourish or punish. Storms could appear suddenly from darkened skies and transform fertile land into chaos overnight. The boundary between survival and catastrophe remained painfully thin. This emotional reality shaped the imagination of the ancient world. When people watched floodwaters swallow homes, fields, animals, and bodies, they were not simply witnessing destruction. They were confronting the terrifying fragility of civilization itself. Cities that took generations to build could disappear within days. Carefully ordered life could collapse beneath rising currents. The flood became more than an event. It became a symbol of chaos breaking through the walls humans built against it. And perhaps that is why flood stories appear with such force in Mesopotamian mythology. The ancient texts speak of waters not only as physical disasters, but as moments when the balance between humanity and the divine world breaks apart. The flood wipes away order and returns existence to something older and more primal. In many traditions, creation begins with separation from chaotic waters. A flood reverses that process. Boundaries dissolve. The world slips backward toward disorder. This fear lived deep inside Mesopotamian society because the threat was always real. Even the greatest cities depended on controlling rivers through canals, levees, and irrigation systems. Human survival required constant labour against the unpredictable movements of water. A failed harvest could bring famine. A flood could destroy years of work overnight. Ancient people understood that civilization rested on fragile foundations. There is something timeless in that realization. Modern humanity often feels protected by technology, yet floods, storms, and disasters still remind people how quickly order can weaken. The ancient fear never fully disappeared. It simply changed form. Beneath modern confidence remains the same awareness that human systems are vulnerable to forces larger than themselves. Mesopotamia understood this deeply. Its flood stories carry emotional weight because they emerged from lived experience, from generations who watched rivers rise and cities struggle to survive. Water represented life, but also judgment, unpredictability, and erasure. It fed civilization while threatening to consume it at any moment. And slowly, within this atmosphere of fear and memory, a larger story began to take shape. A story about divine anger, a chosen survivor, and a flood so immense that later civilizations would remember echoes of it for thousands of years afterward. The waters of Mesopotamia were never only rivers. They became symbols of mankind's oldest fear, that everything built by human hands could vanish beneath darkness and silence without warning at all. As the flood stories of Mesopotamia unfold, one detail begins to stand out with surprising clarity. Before the story of Noah was written into biblical tradition, ancient Mesopotamian texts were already telling of a man warned about a coming destruction, instructed to prepare, and chosen to survive, while the world around him disappeared beneath water. In different versions of the myth, This figure appears under different names: Atrahasis, Utnapishtim. Sometimes the details change, but the emotional structure remains remarkably familiar. Humanity faces catastrophe. The gods decide destruction is necessary. One man receives secret knowledge. A vessel is prepared. Life is preserved while floodwaters consume the earth. The resemblance is difficult to ignore. Yet the Mesopotamian versions carry their own atmosphere and meaning. The chosen survivor is not always selected, because humanity is morally corrupt in the later biblical sense. Instead, the reasons behind the flood can feel more complex, even unsettling. The gods become disturbed by the noise, growth, or disruption created by mankind. Human civilization itself begins to feel burdensome within the divine order. This changes the emotional tone of the story. The flood becomes less about pure moral judgment, and more about control, imbalance, and the fragile relationship between humans and divine authority. Humanity expands, multiplies, builds, and fills the world with activity. At some point, according to these myths, the gods decide the balance has been disturbed beyond tolerance, and still one human is spared. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim receives a warning through hidden communication. He is told to construct a massive boat and preserve life before disaster arrives. The flood that follows is terrifying in scale. Storms rage, waters rise endlessly, civilization disappears beneath chaos. Even the gods themselves are described in some versions as becoming fearful during the destruction they unleashed. There is something deeply haunting about that detail. The flood grows so vast that even divine beings seem unsettled by its power. It feels less like a simple punishment and more like a cosmic event escaping complete control. Humanity becomes small beneath it, fragile against forces capable of erasing entire worlds. And when the waters finally recede, the survivor steps into a changed reality. This pattern carries enormous emotional power because it speaks to one of humanity's oldest fears and oldest hopes at the same time. The fear that civilization can disappear, the hope that memory, life, and meaning might survive destruction through a single fragile thread. Across thousands of years, the image remains strangely vivid. A man warned in secret, a vessel floating through darkness. Waters swallowing the known world. Birds sent into silence, searching for land. These are not small similarities scattered by accident. They feel like echoes moving through time, reshaped by cultures, yet carrying the same ancient emotional core. Still, certainty remains difficult. Perhaps later traditions inherited fragments of older Mesopotamian memory. Perhaps both stories emerged from even older flood experiences now lost to history. Or perhaps human beings everywhere create similar myths because floods touch something universal in the human mind. The tablets never settle the question completely. They simply reveal that long before Noah entered sacred memory, another survivor was already drifting through ancient waters beneath the fearful gaze of gods and the silence of a drowning world. The deeper one looks into the Mesopotamian flood stories. The stranger the reason for destruction begins to feel. In many later traditions, floods are often tied clearly to moral corruption or human wickedness. The world becomes sinful, and divine judgment follows. But the Mesopotamian text describes something more unsettling, something that feels less certain and more deeply connected to the balance between humanity and the gods. In some versions of the myth, humanity becomes too loud. At first, this sounds almost simple, even symbolic. But within the ancient worldview, noise represented more than sound. It reflected growth, movement, expansion, labour, cities, and the restless activity of civilization itself. Humans multiplied, built settlements, worked the land, raised families, and filled the world with life. Eventually, according to the stories, the disturbance became unbearable to the divine powers above them. The gods could no longer rest. This idea changes the emotional meaning of the flood entirely. Humanity is not destroyed only because it is evil. Humanity becomes disruptive. Its presence grows too large, too heavy, too difficult to contain within cosmic order. The flood arrives almost like a reset, a return to silence, after the world has become crowded with human existence. There is something deeply uncomfortable about this possibility. It suggests that mankind's greatest strength, the ability to grow, create, and spread across the earth, may also contain the seed of conflict with the powers that shaped it. Civilization itself becomes both achievement and threat. The more humans build, the more they alter the balance of the world around them. And perhaps this fear still exists today in different forms. Modern humanity covers the planet with cities, machines, lights, roads, and endless movement. The world grows louder every century. Ancient Mesopotamian myths seem to sense an anxiety hidden inside expansion itself, the fear that human activity can eventually overwhelm the balance sustaining life. Other versions of the flood myth introduce themes of overpopulation, divine irritation, and loss of control. The gods appear divided in their response. Some support destruction, while others regret it or secretly help humanity survive. This detail matters because it makes the divine world feel uncertain rather than perfectly unified. Even the gods seem conflicted about what should happen to mankind. That uncertainty gives the flood story emotional depth. The disaster no longer feels like a clean moral event with simple answers. Instead, it feels like a collision between creation and control, between humanity's growth and the limits imposed upon it. The flood becomes an expression of tension inside existence itself. And beneath that tension lies a question that remains disturbingly modern. What happens when human civilization grows beyond the systems meant to contain it? Ancient Mesopotamia may not have understood this in scientific terms, but its myths recognize the fear instinctively. The world can become unstable when balance breaks apart. Water rises. Order collapses. Human power reveals its fragility, so the flood stories endure. Not only because they describe destruction, but because they reveal something darker about how ancient people viewed humanity. Mankind was necessary, creative, and remarkable, yet also capable of becoming too much. Too noisy, too numerous, too disruptive within the larger order of existence. And somewhere inside that fear, the flood begins to resemble not only punishment, but an attempt to restore a silence the gods believed had been lost forever. After the waters recede in the ancient flood stories, something unusual remains behind. Not only survivors, but memory. Civilizations rise and fall, languages disappear, temples collapse into dust, yet certain stories continue traveling forward through time. They change names, details, meanings, and symbols, but the emotional structure survives. A world threatened by destruction, a chosen survivor, divine warning, waters swallowing civilization, renewal after catastrophe. These patterns continue appearing across cultures separated by centuries. Mesopotamia may hold one of the oldest surviving written versions, but the flood itself seems larger than any single civilization. This is what gives the ancient stories their strange feeling of permanence. They do not remain fixed, they evolve. Oral traditions become written texts. Local disasters become sacred history. Myth and memory slowly blend together until separating them becomes almost impossible. Perhaps there was once a real catastrophic flood remembered for generations until it transformed into legend. Ancient river civilizations would certainly have experienced divinity capable of reshaping entire regions. A single traumatic event, retreated through centuries of storytelling, could gradually become cosmic in scale. Or perhaps floods became universal symbols because they express something deeply human. Water erases boundaries. It destroys homes, roads, walls, temples, and kingdoms without caring who built them. A flood reminds people that civilization is temporary, fragile against forces older and larger than human ambition. In this sense, the flood story becomes more than history. It becomes a meditation on impermanence itself, and every culture reshapes that meditation differently. In Mesopotamia, the flood reflects tension between mankind and divine order. In later traditions, it often becomes more moralized, tied to corruption, judgment, and covenant. The core image survives, but its meaning changes depending on the fears and beliefs of the civilization carrying it forward. This is how stories travel through time. They do not move untouched. They absorb the language, spirituality, politics, and emotional needs of each generation. Yet something ancient remains hidden underneath, like the outline of an older city, buried beneath newer foundations. That hidden layer is what makes Mesopotamia so difficult to forget. The ancient flood myths feel like glimpses into the early stages of human memory itself, before later traditions refined and reorganized the story. They allow us to stand near the source, where fear, nature, divine power, and survival were still tangled together in raw form. And perhaps that is why flood stories continue to fascinate people even now. Human beings instinctively understand the fear of losing everything, not only possessions, but identity, order, history, and meaning. The flood represents total uncertainty, yet it also carries another idea quietly beneath the destruction. Survival. A remnant remains. Memory continues. Life begins again after collapse. This balance between erasure and survival may explain why the story endured across thousands of years. Mankind keeps retelling destruction because somewhere deep inside, humanity fears disappearing completely. The flood myth reassures and unsettles at the same time. It reminds us that civilizations can vanish beneath silence, yet stories somehow continue floating forward through history, like fragile vessels carrying memory across dark and endless waters toward futures. No ancient survivor could have imagined waiting beyond the storm. As the ancient world recovered from flood and chaos, another idea began rising quietly through the cities of Mesopotamia. Civilization itself was not viewed as something humans created entirely on their own. Many of the most important parts of life, writing, law, agriculture, astronomy, ritual, and kingship, were believed to have sacred origins connected to the gods. Knowledge did not feel ordinary. To modern people, information is everywhere. It moves endlessly across screens, carried instantly across the world. But in ancient Mesopotamia, knowledge felt rare, powerful, and almost dangerous. The ability to read symbols pressed into clay, predict the movement of stars, organize cities, interpret omens, or preserve sacred rituals separated certain individuals from the rest of society. Wisdom carried authority because it seemed to come from beyond ordinary human experience. The first scribes were not merely writers. They became guardians of memory. Through them, laws survived kings, prayers survived temples, and myths survived civilizations. Writing itself must have appeared almost supernatural during its earliest stages. Marks carved into clay could preserve speech long after the speaker had died. Human thoughts could cross generations. It is difficult to overstate how mysterious this would have felt. In Mesopotamian tradition, many forms of knowledge were associated directly with divine gifts. Agriculture allowed cities to grow. Astronomy connected human life to heavenly patterns. Rituals maintained balance between mankind and unseen powers. Laws brought order against chaos. These were not viewed as random discoveries emerging slowly from human experimentation alone. They belonged to sacred order. This belief reveals something important about the ancient mind. Mesopotamians did not see civilization as fully separate from the divine world. The structures holding society together seemed too profound, too meaningful, to come entirely from human effort. Knowledge itself carried a sacred quality because it shaped reality. A city without writing, law, agriculture, or ritual could not remain stable for long. Wisdom became one of the foundations keeping chaos away. And yet, sacred knowledge always carried tension alongside its power. To know something hidden is to change. Ancient myths repeatedly suggest that wisdom brings responsibility, separation, and risk. A person who understands more than others no longer sees the world in the same way. Knowledge expands awareness, but it can also destroy innocence. This emotional pattern appears again and again throughout human history. People search for hidden truths, believing answers will bring peace. Yet, deeper understanding often reveals heavier questions. Ancient Mesopotamia seems to recognize this paradox very early. Wisdom is precious, but never entirely safe. Civilization advances because knowledge spreads. Yet, every advance also changes humanity itself. Perhaps that is why the origins of wisdom were placed so close to the gods. The ancient world sensed that certain forms of understanding transformed the human condition too deeply to feel ordinary. Writing reshaped memory. Astronomy reshaped humanity's relationship with the heavens. Law reshaped social order. Ritual reshaped the connection between mortal life and sacred reality. And beneath all of these developments rested a quiet assumption that would echo through many later traditions. Some knowledge was meant to guide humanity. Some knowledge might have been dangerous. But either way, the oldest civilizations believed wisdom entered the human world from somewhere beyond mankind itself, carried downward like a sacred fire, capable of illuminating civilization, while also casting shadows no one could completely escape once they had learned to see them clearly. Among the many mysterious figures hidden inside Mesopotamian tradition, few are as fascinating as the beings known as the Appcallu. They appear at the edge of myth and memory, somewhere between divine messengers, wise men, and ancient teachers who carried sacred knowledge into the human world. The old texts describe them in different ways across different eras, but a common image continues to emerge. The Appcallu were associated with wisdom, order, ritual knowledge, and the foundations of civilization itself. In some traditions, they are linked to the time before the Great Flood, as if they belonged to an earlier age, when the boundary between gods and humans felt thinner than it later became. This detail gives them an almost dreamlike quality. The Appcallu are not always presented as rulers or conquerors. Instead, they appear as bringers of knowledge. They teach writing, law, temple rituals, agriculture, and the practices needed to sustain organized life. Civilization, in this view, does not rise naturally from human instinct alone. It must be taught, and perhaps that idea explains why these figures remained so important in Mesopotamian imagination. To ancient people, the leap from survival to civilization must have seemed extraordinary. How did humans move from scattered settlements into cities with laws, astronomy, architecture, and written language? The transformation was so profound that many believed sacred guidance stood behind it. The Appcallu became symbols of that guidance. Some artistic depictions portray them as unusual hybrid beings, connected symbolically to water, wisdom, and protection. Others describe them more like sages who serve divine order. Over time, their image evolved, but the central idea remained remarkably consistent. There existed ancient teachers who helped shape the human world during its earliest stages. This theme appears across many cultures in different forms. Again and again, humanity imagines hidden figures bringing wisdom at the dawn of civilization. Sometimes they are gods, sometimes culture heroes, sometimes wandering teachers. The pattern itself feels ancient, almost instinctive, as though people sensed that civilization arrived too suddenly and too mysteriously to feel entirely accidental. Mesopotamia expressed this feeling through the Appcallu. What makes them especially intriguing is the way they stand between worlds. They are not fully ordinary humans, yet they remain deeply involved with human civilization. They carry sacred knowledge downward into earthly life. In this sense, they resemble bridges connecting divine order with human survival. And like many ancient mysteries, they become more compelling because the details remain incomplete. The tablets preserve fragments rather than perfect explanations. Modern readers encounter pieces of a larger worldview now partially lost. We see traces of ancient beliefs without fully entering the minds of the people who held them. The Appcallu remain suspended inside that uncertainty, half remembered through damaged texts and fading myths. Yet their presence still leaves an impression. They suggest that ancient Mesopotamia viewed wisdoms not as something casually invented, but as something transmitted. Civilization itself carried sacred weight because it emerged through teachings connected to powers beyond ordinary humanity. And perhaps that is why these stories continue to resonate today. People still search for hidden knowledge, forgotten teachers, and lost origins. They still wonder whether humanity learned everything alone, or whether ancient civilizations believed they inherited wisdom from something older and greater than themselves. The Appcallu stand quietly inside that question, watching from the edge of history, like figures remembered from a dream humanity never fully forgot after waking into civilization. If knowledge was sacred in the ancient world, it also carried danger close behind it. Mesopotamian myths repeatedly suggest that wisdom is never neutral. To understand more is to cross boundaries, and once those boundaries are crossed, neither individuals nor civilizations remain unchanged. This idea appears quietly throughout the old stories. Human beings seek understanding because knowledge brings power. Writing preserves memory. Astronomy predicts heavenly movements. Rituals promise protection. Laws create order. But every new layer of awareness also separates people from innocence. The more humanity understands, the heavier existence becomes. Ancient Mesopotamia seemed deeply aware of this tension. The gods themselves often guard knowledge carefully. Certain truths belong to priests, scribes, kings, or sacred traditions rather than ordinary people. Hidden names, rituals, omens, and cosmic patterns carried immense importance because they were believed to influence the balance between humanity and divine order. To know too much could become dangerous. This danger was not always physical. Sometimes it was psychological. Awareness changes the one who receives it. A person who understands mortality cannot return to the peace of ignorance. A civilization that discovers writing cannot return fully to oral memory. Knowledge expands the human mind while also exposing it to fear, responsibility, and uncertainty. Perhaps this is why ancient myths so often connect wisdom with loss. The search for understanding can bring greatness, but it can also create distance between humanity and simplicity. Mesopotamian stories frequently portray humans striving for something beyond their natural limits. Whether immortality, divine favour, cosmic secrets, or forbidden insight. Yet the closer people move toward ultimate knowledge, the more fragile they seem to become. The Epic of Gilgamesh carries this feeling strongly. Gilgamesh seeks immortality after confronting death, driven by the unbearable realization that human life ends. His journey is not only physical, it is emotional and existential. Once he understands mortality fully, he cannot return to the comfort he possessed before. Knowledge has transformed him permanently. This pattern still shapes human experience today. People often imagine truth as liberation, yet deeper understanding can also produce anxiety. The more humanity learns about the universe, time, history, and itself, the more complicated existence appears. Ancient Mesopotamia recognized that wisdom enlarges both power and burden at the same time. And beneath many of these stories lies a deeper fear. What if there are boundaries humans were never meant to cross? This question appears across countless traditions because it reflects something ancient inside the human mind. Curiosity drives civilization forward, yet curiosity also threatens established order. Every discovery changes the relationship between humanity and the unknown. Mesopotamian mythology does not fully condemn the search for wisdom, but neither does it portray knowledge as harmless. Sacred understanding demands responsibility. Hidden truths reshape the soul. The farther humans move toward divine awareness, the farther they may drift from innocence, certainty, or peace. That may be why the old myths still feel strangely modern. Human beings continue reaching for greater power, deeper understanding, and hidden answers, while quietly fearing the consequences of what they might uncover. The ancient stories remind us that wisdom has always carried a cost. To know more is to become more aware of mortality, limitation, and mystery. And once awareness enters the human mind, it never completely leaves again, even after civilizations fall into silence and dust around the questions they once asked. As the Mesopotamian stories of knowledge unfold, certain images begin to feel quietly familiar again. Sacred spaces, divine boundaries, wisdom that changes the one who receives it, a shift from innocence into awareness. A world where knowledge is not merely information, but a force capable of altering humanity's place within creation. These themes do not need to be forced together. They seem to gather naturally. In Mesopotamian thought, sacred places were often imagined as points where heaven and earth touched. Temples rose like artificial mountains, reaching upward from the flat plains. Gardens, rivers, trees, and ordered spaces carried symbolic weight because they suggested life shaped by divine presence. The world was not empty matter. It was arranged, guarded, and filled with meaning. But sacred order often came with limits. Some things could be approached, others had to remain hidden. Some rituals could be performed only by certain people. Some names, signs, and patterns belonged to trained priests and scribes. Knowledge had pathways, but also gates. The ancient world understood that not every truth was freely available to everyone. This creates a feeling that echoes through later sacred traditions. There is the sense of a protected space, the presence of divine authority, the human desire to understand more than it has been given, the possibility that wisdom may open the eyes, but also change the relationship between humanity and the sacred. Even without naming later stories directly, the emotional shape feels recognizable. What makes Mesopotamia so compelling is that these ideas appear in a world older than many familiar religious forms. The stories do not match perfectly, and they should not be flattened into one another. Their gods are different. Their moral structures are different. Their view of humanity is often more practical and severe. Yet beneath those differences, certain patterns seem to move like roots under the soil. A sacred place is established. A boundary exists. Knowledge waits near that boundary. Humanity approaches. Something changes. Perhaps this pattern survives because it reflects a truth deeper than any single text. Human beings are drawn toward what is hidden. We want to know the rule, then understand why the rule exists. We want to remain safe, yet we also want to cross the threshold. We fear consequences, but fear ignorance too. That tension lives inside every story of forbidden or sacred knowledge. Ancient Mesopotamia gave that tension its own language. It spoke through gods, tablets, temples, sages, and rituals. Later traditions would speak through different images, different names, and different moral worlds. But the underlying feeling remains hauntingly similar. Knowledge can awaken mankind, yet awakening is never simple. Once the eyes open, innocence cannot return in the same form. This does not make knowledge evil. It makes it powerful. It gives humanity memory, law, civilization, and self-awareness. But it also introduces restlessness, responsibility, and longing. The human being becomes aware of being human, aware of limits, aware of death, aware that something has been lost or hidden. And so, as we leave the world of sacred knowledge, we begin to see Mesopotamia not only as a land of myth, but as a civilization built around thresholds, between gods and humans, between ignorance and wisdom, between clay and spirit, between the first garden-like visions of order and the restless cities that rose from the earth to preserve that order. As Mesopotamian civilizations expanded across the river plains, something extraordinary began taking shape in human history. Villages became cities, temples grew taller, trade routes stretched across distant lands. Writing organized memory, laws organized behavior. Humanity was no longer simply surviving beside nature. It was building systems designed to endure beyond individual lives. To the people of Mesopotamia, this transformation did not feel entirely human. Cities like Uruk rose with astonishing speed compared to earlier human settlements. Massive walls surrounded dense populations. Temples dominated the skyline. Canals redirected rivers. Labor became specialized. Priests, scribes, merchants, craftsmen, and rulers all occupied defined roles within increasingly complex societies. Civilization itself must have felt almost miraculous. How could human beings, fragile and mortal, create structures so organized and immense? Mesopotamian culture answered this question by placing divine influence at the center of urban life. The first cities were not viewed merely as practical developments. They were connected to sacred order. Uruk, one of the oldest great cities, was associated with powerful deities and legendary rulers. It all symbolized more than protection. They represented humanity's attempt to establish permanence against chaos. Temples stood at the heart of these cities because divine presence was believed to sustain the world humans were building. This gave civilization a deeply spiritual atmosphere. Agriculture relied on controlled irrigation. Irrigation required coordination. Coordination required law, labor, hierarchy, and memory. Every part of the system depended on the others. A failure in one area could threaten the survival of thousands. Ancient people understood how fragile organized life truly was, and perhaps this is why civilization came to feel sacred. Mesopotamians did not imagine cities emerging accidentally from random human ambition alone. Civilization seemed too structured, too meaningful, too dependent on cosmic balance. The gods were believed to oversee kingship, agriculture, justice, and social order, because these forces held society together against the ever-present threat of collapse. The city became a kind of experiment in maintaining order against chaos. Beyond the walls stretched uncertainty, floods, invasion, famine, wild landscapes, and wandering peoples all represented instability. Inside the city, humans attempted to create predictability through law, ritual, labor, and divine favor. Civilization was both protection and burden at the same time. There is something deeply familiar about this tension. Modern cities still function through invisible systems most people rarely notice until those systems fail. Electricity, water, law, trade, communication, and labour quietly sustain daily life. Ancient Mesopotamia understood the same principle in its own way. Order is never permanent. It must constantly be maintained. This may explain why early civilizations placed such importance on sacred authority. The city did not simply belong to humans. It belonged within a larger cosmic structure. Temples connected earthly society to divine order, while kings acted as guardians of balance between the two worlds. Civilization itself became evidence that humans were participating in something greater than survival alone. And yet, beneath the pride of these first cities remained an unsettling possibility. What if civilization was not entirely humanity's achievement? What if the systems shaping human life were part of a larger design humans only partially understood? Mesopotamia leaves this question quietly unresolved, allowing the first great cities to stand both as monuments to human brilliance and as signs of a mysterious order that may have guided mankind from the very beginning. Among the oldest surviving texts of Mesopotamia is a document known today as the Sumerian King List. At first glance, it appears simple enough, a record of rulers, cities, and dynasties stretching across vast spans of time. But hidden inside the text is a phrase that reveals something profound about how ancient people understood authority. It says that kingship descended from heaven. To the modern mind, political power is usually explained through armies, economics, inheritance, or social systems. Mesopotamians understood power differently. A king did not rule only because he was strong. He ruled because divine order allowed him to rule. Authority itself was sacred in origin. This belief shaped the entire structure of civilization. The king stood between worlds. He governed earthly society, while serving the gods connected to the city and land. His success reflected cosmic balance. His failures could signal divine displeasure. War, harvests, floods, and stability were interpreted through this sacred relationship between ruler and heaven. In many ways, kingship became a visible expression of invisible order. The Sumerian King List itself carries an almost dreamlike quality. Some rulers are said to have reigned for impossibly long periods before the flood, as though they belonged partly to myth rather than ordinary history. After the flood, reign lengths become shorter, more human, more recognizable. The text creates the feeling of a distant age when the boundary between divine and earthly authority was closer than it later became. This transition matters. It suggests that Mesopotamians viewed early kingship as something emerging directly from sacred origins before gradually settling into ordinary human history. The oldest rulers seem larger than life, standing at the edge of memory where myth and reality still overlap. And yet, even later kings continued claiming divine connection. Temples were built in the names of gods. Victories were credited to divine favour. Laws were presented as sacred obligations rather than personal inventions. A king's role was not merely to command armies or collect tribute. He maintained order against chaos. That responsibility carried enormous symbolic weight. Mesopotamian civilization existed in an environment where collapse always remained possible. Rivers could flood unpredictably. Empires could fall suddenly. Famine, invasion, and rebellion threatened stability constantly. The ruler became a guardian of balance, holding civilization together beneath the watch of divine powers. This may explain why kingship was treated with such reverence. Without order, the city could dissolve into chaos. Without sacred legitimacy, authority itself could become unstable. Ancient people feared disorder deeply. because they understood how fragile civilization truly was. The king represented continuity against uncertainty. But there is another side to this story as well. If authority descends from heaven, then ordinary humans never fully own their society. Power flows downward from something greater. Kings govern, but they also serve. Even rulers remain bound beneath divine systems they did not create. That idea gives Mesopotamian kingship a strangely philosophical quality. The ancient world did not imagine freedom in the modern sense. It imagined hierarchy woven into the structure of existence itself. Gods above kings, kings above cities, cities above labourers, everything connected through chains of responsibility and dependence. And perhaps that's why the old phrase still feels so haunting today. Kingship descended from heaven, not earned, not invented, but granted. A reminder that the first civilizations believed human order reflected something older, higher, and far more mysterious than human ambition alone ever could. In the cities of ancient Mesopotamia, the temple stood at the center of everything. It was not only a place of worship in the modern sense. The temple was economic center, political symbol, storage house, ritual space, and meeting point between humanity and the divine world. To understand Mesopotamian civilization, one must understand that religion was not separated from daily life. It shaped the structure of reality itself. The temple made the invisible feel present. Towering above the city, ziggurats rose like artificial mountains from the flat plains of Mesopotamia. Their height carried symbolic meaning. They connected earth and heaven, human society, and divine authority. From a distance, these structures must have appeared almost unreal against the open sky, standing as visible reminders that the city belonged to powers greater than the people living within it. Everything moved around them. Priests organized rituals to maintain harmony between gods and mankind. Offerings were brought regularly because divine favor was believed necessary for survival. Grain, livestock, and resources flowed through temple systems. Scribes recorded transactions and sacred texts. Workers maintained buildings, canals, and storage facility connected to temple economies. The sacred and practical existed together without separation. To modern minds, this may feel unusual, because religion is often treated as one part of life among many others. In Mesopotamia, the temple was life organized into sacred order. Agriculture, law, politics, labor, and spirituality all met within the same structure. This gave civilization a powerful sense of meaning. The city was not random. Its systems reflected cosmic balance. The temple acted as the heart of that balance, continuously reinforcing the relationship between humanity and the divine forces believed to govern existence. Without ritual and proper order, people feared chaos might return. And chaos was never imagined as far away. Floods, famine, war, and collapse always lingered at the edge of civilization. The temple represented stability against those dangers. Its rituals reassured people that the world remained connected to sacred order. Even daily routines gained spiritual significance because survival itself depended on maintaining balance with unseen powers. There is something psychologically profound about this arrangement. Human beings often search for centers, places, or systems that make life feel ordered and meaningful. Ancient Mesopotamia found that center in the temple. It gave people structure inside an uncertain world. It explained suffering, justified authority, organized labor, and connected ordinary existence to something eternal. Yet the temple also reinforced hierarchy. Access to sacred knowledge remained limited. Priests interpreted divine will. Kings acted under heavenly approval. Ordinary people participated in rituals, but much of the deeper symbolic world remained controlled by specialized classes connected to the temple system. This created both stability and dependence. Civilization became inseparable from sacred authority. The city functioned because humans believed the gods inhabited its center. Every offering, law, and ritual strengthened that belief further. The temple did not merely symbolize reality. For Mesopotamians, it helped sustain reality itself. And perhaps that is why these ancient structures continue to fascinate modern people. Even in ruins, the temples of Mesopotamia still radiate the feeling that they once stood at the center of an entire worldview. They remind us that the first great cities were not built only around trade or survival. They were built around humanity's need to believe that existence itself rested upon sacred foundations, guarded against chaos by ritual, memory, and the constant presence of powers watching from beyond ordinary sight. By the time Mesopotamian cities reached their height, humanity had created something astonishing. Streets, temples, walls, markets, canals, archives, workshops, and palaces formed living systems far larger than any individual person. A single city could hold thousands of lives inside one shared order, all moving according to rhythms of labor, ritual, trade, and authority. Yet the deeper we look, the more uncertain the question becomes. Did mankind build these cities freely, or were cities built around mankind as part of a greater design? In Mesopotamian thought, civilization did not exist only for human comfort. The city served the gods, temples required offerings, fields supported sacred economies, workers maintained canals, storehouses, walls, and shrines. Kings ruled beneath divine approval. Priests guarded rituals and knowledge. Every human role seemed connected to something beyond human desire. This creates a very different image of civilization. A modern person might look at ancient cities and see progress, the rise of architecture, administration, agriculture, writing, and law. And that is true. But a Mesopotamian may also have seen duty. The city was not just a monument to human achievement. It was a sacred machine, constantly maintained to keep chaos away and divine order alive. Inside that machine, mankind carried the burden of continuity. The canals had to be cleared, the grain had to be stored, the temples had to be supplied, the rituals had to be performed, the king had to rule correctly, the scribes had to remember. Civilization could not rest, because disorder never stopped pressing against its edges. This brings us back to the oldest creation question. If humans were made to relieve divine labor, then the city becomes the place where that purpose is organized. Labor is no longer scattered. It becomes structured, counted, recorded, and sanctified. People do not merely work to survive. They work inside a system that gives their labor cosmic meaning, but also binds them more tightly to authority. There is beauty in this, and there is weight. The beauty is that human life becomes part of something vast. A farmer, builder, priest, scribe, or king all participate in preserving order against chaos. The weight is that the individual becomes small inside the structure. Personal freedom fades beneath obligation, hierarchy, and sacred expectation. Perhaps this is why the first cities feel both inspiring and haunting. They show humanity rising above survival, but also entering systems that would shape life for thousands of years afterward. Work, law, class, authority, sacred power, and organized memory all become permanent features of civilization. And maybe Mesopotamia understood something we still struggle to admit. Civilization is not only what humans build, it is also what builds humans. It shapes how they think, labor, worship, fear, and imagine their place in the universe. The first cities did not simply rise from the earth. They gathered mankind into patterns older than any single life. Patterns that still echo in every system humans live inside today. stories rarely stay where they begin. They move with merchants across trade routes, with prisoners into exile, with scribes copying old text by lamplight, and with travellers carrying memories between cities separated by deserts, rivers, and generations. Long before the modern world had connected distant cultures instantly, ancient civilizations were already exchanging ideas through conquest, migration, war, and survival. Mesopotamia stood near the centre of many of these movements. For thousands of years, empires rose and fell across the region. Sumerians gave way to Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. Armies crossed the fertile plains. Kingdoms absorbed neighbouring cultures. Sacred traditions mixed slowly over centuries. No civilization remained completely isolated, and wherever people moved, stories moved with them. This is important when thinking about the relationship between Mesopotamian myths and later biblical traditions. Ancient texts did not exist inside sealed worlds. Oral traditions circulated long before they were written down. Scribes borrowed images, symbols, and narrative patterns while reshaping them according to new beliefs and historical experiences. The ancient Near East was filled with shared cultural memory. Flood stories, creation myths, divine councils, sacred mountains, heavenly kingship, and humanity, formed from Earth, all existed within this larger atmosphere of storytelling. Different civilizations interpreted these themes differently, but the ideas themselves travelled across centuries like rivers changing course while remaining connected to the same source. One historical event especially deepened this connection. During the Babylonian exile, many Israelites were taken into Babylon after the destruction of Jerusalem in the 6th century BCE. They entered a civilization filled with ancient myths, libraries, temple, traditions, and stories far older than their own kingdom. This does not mean later biblical writings simply copied Mesopotamian texts directly. History is more layered than that. But it does mean these cultures existed in conversation with one another, and conversations leave traces. A people living inside Babylonian influence would inevitably encounter older traditions surrounding creation, flood narratives, kingship, sacred law, and cosmic order. Yet when these themes appeared in biblical tradition, they were transformed. The stories began serving different theological and moral purposes. This process is deeply human. Cultures rarely preserve stories unchanged. They adapt them according to their fears, hopes, and experiences. A flood can become judgment. A creation story can become covenant. A divine council can become a more unified vision of sacred authority. Beneath the changes, however, older patterns sometimes remain visible, like faded shapes beneath newer paint. Perhaps this is why Mesopotamia feels so haunting to modern readers. It resembles standing near the roots of a tree whose branches spread across later civilizations. The roots are not identical to the branches, yet they nourish what comes afterward. Ancient memory survives through transformation, and maybe that is the true power of stories. Empires collapse, languages disappear, and temples turn to ruins, yet narratives continue travelling forward through human minds. They evolve because people evolve. Each generation reshapes inherited memory into forms that answer its own deepest questions. Mesopotamia understood creation, flood, kingship, and divine order through its own sacred lens. Later traditions would reinterpret those same themes differently, but somewhere beneath the shift meanings, the older memory continued moving quietly through history, crossing rivers, deserts, kingdoms, and centuries without ever fully disappearing from the human imagination entirely. When people compare Mesopotamian stories with later biblical traditions, the similarities can feel striking at first. Humans formed from earth, great floods, divine judgment, sacred gardens, chosen survivors, heavenly authority shaping the destiny of mankind. These images appear across both worlds with enough resemblance to provoke curiosity almost immediately, but similarity does not always mean sameness. This is where the ancient stories become far more interesting than simple arguments about copying or coincidence. Symbols can travel through cultures while changing meaning completely. The same image may carry one emotional purpose in Mesopotamia and another in biblical tradition. Take clay, for example. In Mesopotamian mythology, humans shaped from clay often exist within systems of labour, duty, and divine necessity. Humanity is tied closely to service and maintenance of cosmic order. The image feels practical, almost administrative in its sacred logic. In later biblical tradition, the formation of man from dust carries a kas, a more intimate emotional tone connected to divine intention, mortality, and relationship. The material is similar. The meaning shifts. The flood stories reveal a similar transformation. Mesopotamian floods often emerge from tension between humanity and divine order, sometimes connected to noise, overpopulation, or disruption. Later biblical tradition frames the flood more clearly around morality, corruption, and covenant. Destruction remains central in both, but the purpose behind the destruction evolves. This pattern repeats across many symbols. Sacred spaces exist in both traditions, yet they function differently. Divine authority appears in both, but with different structures. Human suffering, mortality, obedience, and knowledge all remain important themes. Yet each civilization arranges those themes according to its own understanding of the universe. And perhaps that is exactly what makes these comparisons so fascinating. The ancient world was not divided into isolated boxes where cultures invented everything independently. Ideas moved, blended, transformed, and survived through contact between peoples. Yet every civilization reshaped, inherited symbols into stories reflecting its own deepest concerns. Mesopotamia often presents a world of layered divine hierarchy, cosmic maintenance, and fragile balance between humans and powerful gods. Biblical tradition gradually moves toward a more unified moral vision centered around covenant, justice, and sacred relationship between humanity and one supreme divine authority. The emotional atmosphere changes even when certain symbols remain familiar. This reminds us that stories are living things. They adapt because human societies adapt. A symbol survives not because it remains frozen, but because it continues speaking to new fears and new hopes across generations. Perhaps that is why the same images continue appearing throughout history. Clay reflects mortality and formation. Floods reflect destruction and renewal. Gardens reflect order and innocence. Sacred mountains reflect connection between heaven and earth. These symbols endure because they touch something deep inside human consciousness itself. Mesopotamia and later biblical traditions do not mirror each other perfectly, nor should they. They belong to different spiritual worlds shaped by different historical experiences. Yet beneath those differences, certain ancient patterns continue echoing quietly across time. And maybe that echo matters more than certainty ever could, because it suggests that humanity has always returned to the same core mysteries using different languages and sacred frameworks. The symbols survive because the questions survive. Who created us? Why does suffering exist? What separates order from chaos? And what happens when human beings cross boundaries? They were never entirely meant to understand completely within the fragile structure of existence itself. As older Mesopotamian themes moved into later biblical tradition, something important began to change. The familiar symbols remained: creation, flood, divine authority, sacred law. But the emotional and spiritual structure surrounding those symbols slowly transformed into something different. The world became morally sharper. In Mesopotamian mythology, the universe often feels politically divine. Many gods exist with competing desires, responsibilities, and limitations. Humanity lives beneath a layered cosmic order where floods, suffering, labour, and fate emerge from tensions inside that system. The gods can appear unpredictable, divided, or emotionally complex in ways that resemble powerful rulers more than purely moral beings. Biblical tradition gradually reshapes this atmosphere. Instead of many divine powers governing separate aspects of reality, the story moves toward one supreme authority, overseeing creation entirely. This changes everything. Human beings are no longer caught between competing divine personalities. They stand beneath a single moral center that defines justice, covenant, obedience, and meaning. The same symbols now carry different emotional weight. Creation becomes more than functional. It becomes intentional in a deeply personal sense. Humanity is not simply formed to maintain order or relieve divine burden. Human life carries moral significance tied directly to sacred relationship. Flood becomes not only cosmic reset, but judgment against corruption. Law becomes covenant rather than administrative necessity alone. Even suffering begins to change meaning. In Mesopotamian thought, suffering often reflects instability within existence itself. Floods, famine, mortality, and chaos are woven into the structure of the world. In biblical tradition, suffering becomes increasingly connected to moral consequence, disobedience, testing, or separation from divine will. This transformation creates a very different relationship between humanity and the sacred. Mesopotamian myths often leave humans feeling small beneath vast cosmic systems. Biblical tradition, while still emphasizing divine authority, gradually introduces a stronger sense of moral relationship between humanity and God. Humans remain fragile, but their choices carry deeper ethical meaning inside the story. And yet, traces of the older atmosphere still remain visible beneath the surface. The flood still destroys civilization. Humans still emerge from Earth. Sacred law still organizes society. Divine power still shapes kingship and destiny. The older bones remain, even as the spiritual structure around them changes. Perhaps this is why the comparison between these traditions feels so compelling. It is not merely about similarities, it is about transformation. Watching ideas evolve across centuries reveals how civilizations reinterpret inherited memory according to new historical realities and spiritual needs. Mesopotamia gave the ancient world one vision of humanity, a vision shaped by labor, hierarchy, cosmic balance, and fragile order beneath many gods. Biblical tradition inherited parts of that ancient atmosphere, then redirected them toward covenant, morality, and the relationship between humanity and one divine authority. The stories changed because the civilizations telling them changed. And maybe that is what sacred tradition has always done. It preserves memory while reshaping it into forms capable of guiding new generations through new fears and uncertainties. Still, beneath all these transformations, something older continues whispering through the texts. The ancient flood, the clay of creation, the sacred boundaries, the fear of chaos, the longing for order, the feeling that human beings entered a world already carrying meaning before they fully understood themselves. That older memory never disappears completely. It simply changes language while continuing to move quietly beneath the surface of human history. After tracing these ancient stories across civilizations, one feeling remains stronger than any single conclusion. Beneath the written texts themselves, beneath temples, myths, kingdoms, and sacred traditions, there seems to linger an older layer of human memory that refuses to disappear completely. Not memory in the ordinary sense. No living person remembers the first cities of Sumer or the earliest flood survivors of Mesopotamian myth. Entire languages vanished long ago. Empires collapsed into dust. Yet certain images continue returning across centuries, as though humanity keeps circling around the same questions without ever fully escaping them. Creation from earth, waters of destruction, sacred law, divine authority, human mortality, forbidden knowledge, the fragile balance between order and chaos. These themes feel ancient because they are tied to experiences older than written history itself. Long before civilizations carved symbols into clay, humans already feared storms, death, hunger, disorder, and the silence of the unknown. They already looked at the stars, wondering whether the universe carried intention or indifference. When writing finally emerged in Mesopotamia, those fears and questions entered permanent memory for the first time. The tablets became containers for human consciousness. This is why Mesopotamia feels so haunting. It stands near the beginning of recorded thought, where myth and reality still blend together in raw form. The ancient texts do not always separate history from symbolism, because the people creating them experienced the world differently from modern minds. Nature, divinity, politics and survival all flowed together inside one sacred reality. And perhaps something of that older way of seeing still survives inside us. Modern people often believe they have moved beyond ancient myths, yet the same emotional patterns continue shaping human life. People still search for purpose. They still fear collapse. They still wonder whether suffering has meaning. They still imagine hidden truths buried beneath ordinary existence. The ancient stories endure because the ancient questions endure. This does not mean every myth must be read literally, nor does it mean every similarity proves direct inheritance. Human history is too layered and mysterious for simple answers, but the persistence of these themes suggests that civilizations were not merely inventing random stories. They were wrestling with recurring truths about human existence. Mesopotamia preserved some of the oldest surviving versions of that struggle, and beneath the details of gods, floods, and kings lies something deeply personal, the feeling that humanity remembers more than it can fully explain. A sense that certain fears and symbols existed long before formal religion organized them into doctrine, almost like fragments of emotional memory passed silently from generation to generation. Perhaps this is why ancient ruins affect people so strongly. Broken temples and buried cities remind us that civilizations disappear, but human longing does not. The same questions rise again beneath different languages and different sacred systems. Every age believes it stands at the center of history, yet each eventually becomes another layer beneath the next. Mesopotamia understood this in its own way. Its stories speak from a world already haunted by flood, mortality, labour, and divine uncertainty. And even now, thousands of years later, those old voices still reach outward and out, road through damaged clay and fading myths, carrying the strange possibility that mankind has been trying to remember something important for far longer than history itself can clearly explain to us anymore. After all the ancient cities, tablets, gods, floods, and forgotten kings, the journey through Mesopotamia returns quietly to the same place where humanity has always begun. A question. Who are we? It is the oldest question because every civilization eventually asks it in one form or another. The names change, the symbols change, religions rise, empires spread, philosophies evolve, yet the human mind continues circling back toward the mystery of its own existence. Mesopotamia asked the question early. perhaps earlier than any civilization whose written thoughts still survive today. Its answers were complex and often unsettling. Humanity was shaped from clay, yet touched by divine essence. People were necessary, but burdened. Civilization carried sacred order, yet remained fragile against chaos. Knowledge elevated mankind, while also separating it from innocence. Floods could erase entire worlds. Kings ruled beneath powers greater than themselves. These are not comforting stories in the simple sense. And maybe that is why they still feel powerful. Mesopotamian mythology does not pretend human existence is easy to explain. It presents life as meaningful yet uncertain, sacred yet heavy, ordered yet always threatened by collapse. Modern humanity may appear distant from that world, but emotionally the connection remains surprisingly close. People still struggle with purpose. They still search for identity inside systems larger than themselves. They still fear disaster, death, loneliness, and meaninglessness. They still wonder whether human consciousness is accidental or intentional. Ancient Mesopotamia recognized these tensions thousands of years ago beneath the same stars modern people see tonight. This continuity across time feels almost haunting, a person lying awake in the modern world. Searching quietly for meaning is not so different from an ancient scribe staring into temple firelight beside the rivers of Sumer. The technologies changed, the questions did not. Perhaps that is why these ancient myths survive so stubbornly. They are not preserved only because historians study them. They endure because they touch emotional structures deeply rooted inside human consciousness. The fear of chaos, the longing for order, the desire to understand suffering, the hope that existence contains purpose beyond survival alone. Mesopotamia gave those feelings symbolic form. Its stories transformed human uncertainty into gods, floods, sacred laws, and cosmic systems. Through myth, ancient people attempted to place themselves inside a universe that often felt overwhelming and unstable. In doing so, they created narratives that still resonate because modern life has not erased the underlying uncertainty of being human. Even now, despite scientific progress and technological power, people continue asking the same ancient questions. Why are we here? Are we free? Why must we suffer? What happens after death? Is civilization meaningful or temporary? Does humanities serve a larger purpose? Or create its own meaning against silence? Mesopotamia never answered these questions completely. No civilization ever has. But perhaps complete answers were never the point, the value of these ancient stories lie partly in their willingness to confront mystery directly, instead of pretending it does not exist. They remind us that human beings have always lived between certainty and uncertainty, between knowledge and fear, between clay and longing. And somewhere inside that tension, the oldest question continues whispering through history, unchanged even after thousands of years have passed around it in silence. The image appears again and again throughout the old Mesopotamian stories. A human being formed from clay, yet carrying something more within. Earth mixed with divine essence, dust shaped into awareness, mortality touched by longing. Perhaps no ancient symbol captures the human condition more completely than this one. Clay represents weakness. It cracks, erodes, breaks, and returns to the earth from which it came. Human bodies follow the same path. They age slowly, tire easily, suffer illness, and eventually disappear into death, no matter how powerful or intelligent the person once seemed. Mesopotamia understood this reality clearly. The ancient world lived close to mortality. Floods, famine, disease, and war constantly reminded people how fragile life truly was. And yet, human beings never behaved as though they were only fragile creatures. They built cities meant to outlast generations. They mapped the stars. They searched for immortality through stories, monuments, religion, and memory. They looked beyond survival toward meaning. Something inside humanity refused to remain fully grounded in the earth. This contradiction sits at the center of Mesopotamian creation. People belong to the material world, but they are restless within it. They labor like earthly creatures, while imagining eternity like divine beings. They carry instinct, fear, and hunger, yet also philosophy, imagination, and spiritual longing. The ancient myths express this tension symbolically through the mixture of clay and sacred essence. Humanity exists between worlds. Perhaps this explains why people so often feel divided within themselves. One part seeks comfort, safety, food, and survival. Another part searches endlessly for truth, beauty, justice, transcendence, and permanence. Human beings seem unable to stop reaching beyond immediate existence, even while knowing they will eventually die. Mesopotamia recognized this restlessness long before modern psychology or philosophy attempted to describe it. The old myths suggest that mankind's burden is not only labor or mortality, it is consciousness itself. To be human means to know enough to ask questions that cannot be answered completely. It means carrying awareness inside a temporary body. It means sensing something greater while never fully touching it. That awareness can feel beautiful, but also painful. Humans create art because ordinary life feels incomplete. They search for hidden knowledge because the visible world rarely satisfies them fully. They form religions, philosophies, and civilizations because they cannot accept existence as meaningless silence. Ancient Mesopotamia transformed these emotional realities into sacred stories about humanity's origin. And perhaps those stories still matter, because they describe something timeless. Modern people continue living between clay and the divine in their own way. Bodies remain mortal, minds remain restless. Civilization grows more advanced, yet human longings survives unchanged beneath technology and modern systems. The old Mesopotamian myths do not offer easy comfort about this condition. Instead, they quietly acknowledge its complexity. Humanity is neither purely animal nor fully divine. It exists in between, carrying weakness and wonder together. Maybe that is why the image remains so difficult to forget. A creature shaped from earth, burdened with labor, haunted by death, yet still capable of imagining eternity. A being fragile enough to disappear, yet conscious enough to ask why it was created at all. Mesopotamia leaves us with that haunting picture of mankind, suspended forever between dust below and mystery above. When all the fragments of Mesopotamian mythology are placed beside one another, a distinct vision of mankind slowly emerges from the ancient dust. It is not identical to later traditions, though echoes remain visible. It is older in atmosphere, heavier in tone, and deeply shaped by the realities of the first great civilizations. Mesopotamia told a different story about what it meant to be human. In this story, the gods are powerful, numerous, and deeply involved in earthly existence. They shape rivers, storms, kingship, fertility, labor, and destiny itself. Humanity does not stand alone beneath the heavens. It exists inside a vast system already occupied by sacred authority and cosmic hierarchy. Creation carries purpose, but also burden. Humans are formed from clay, mixed with divine essence. Beings tied both to earth and something beyond it. Yet, mankind is not always portrayed as the center of divine affection. In many myths, people exist to maintain order, perform labor, preserve civilization, and serve the structures established by higher powers. This creates a worldview filled with tension. Humanity is meaningful but fragile, sacred yet limited, creative yet vulnerable to forces capable of destroying entire cities overnight. Floods emerge not only as punishments, but as reminders that civilization rests upon unstable foundations. Chaos waits constantly beyond the walls. Humans build against it. Knowledge becomes another source of tension. Wisdom allows civilization to rise, but awareness also changes humanity forever. Writing, ritual, astronomy, sacred lore, and hidden teachings elevate human life while increasing responsibility and uncertainty. The more mankind understands, the farther it moves from innocence. And throughout these stories, divine order remains central. Kings rule because sacred authority permits them to rule. Temples organize society because the gods stand at the center of reality itself. Civilization survives through constant maintenance against disorder. Human beings do not simply live inside nature. They participate in preserving a cosmic balance larger than themselves. This is the different story, Mesopotamia whispered into history. It is not purely hopeful or purely despairing. Instead, it feels strangely realistic in emotional tone. Life contains meaning, but also labor. Consciousness brings wonder, but also suffering. Civilization creates beauty, but remains vulnerable to collapse. Humans seek immortality while carrying the certainty of death inside them from birth. Perhaps this is why the myths continue affecting modern minds. They do not present humanity as simple. They recognize contradiction at the heart of existence. People build temples while fearing chaos. They seek wisdom while fearing what knowledge reveals. They create systems of order while sensing how temporary those systems truly are. And even after thousands of years, these tensions still define human life. Modern civilization may appear vastly different from ancient Mesopotamia, yet the deeper questions remain remarkably familiar. Humanity still struggles with power, purpose, mortality, knowledge, and the fear of collapse. The old myths survive because they speak to conditions that never fully disappear. Mesopotamia did not merely preserve stories about gods and ancient cities. It preserved a vision of mankind itself. A vision where human beings stand between earth and mystery, building fragile civilizations beneath uncertain heavens while searching endlessly for meaning inside a world that never completely explains why it created them in the first place at all. Even now, much of ancient Mesopotamia remains buried. Beneath deserts, ruined cities, broken walls, and forgotten temple foundations, countless fragments of the ancient world still wait in silence. Some tablets remain unread, others survive only in shattered pieces. Entire libraries may still rest beneath layers of earth untouched for thousands of years, carrying stories nobody living today has heard yet. There is something deeply haunting about that thought. Humanity often imagines history as complete, organized neatly into timelines and textbooks. But Mesopotamia reminds us how much has been lost. Whole civilizations vanished long before the modern world began asking questions about them. Languages disappeared, temples collapsed, memories faded into myth, and yet not everything vanished completely. A few clay tablets survived floods, wars, fire, and time itself. Through them, voices from the earliest cities continue speaking faintly across thousands of years. They speak about creation, labor, kingship, floods, sacred knowledge, mortality, and the strange position of mankind between weakness and longing. The survival of these fragments feels almost accidental. Clay should not have outlived empires. Yet somehow it did. Ancient scribes pressing symbols into wet earth could never have imagined modern eyes reading their words beneath electric light. Thousands of years later. Still, their stories endured long enough to reach another age entirely. Perhaps that endurance carries its own meaning. Mesopotamia may never reveal all its secrets. Too much time has passed. Too many texts are damaged or missing. History itself remains incomplete. But maybe the mystery is part of the reason these ancient stories continue holding such power over the imagination. The unanswered questions keep breathing. Were these myths symbolic attempts to explain existence, or memories rooted in events ancient people believed were real? Did later traditions inherit fragments of older Mesopotamian thought more deeply than history can fully trace? How much of humanity's earliest understanding of itself has already been lost forever beneath ruins and sand? The Old World does not answer clearly. Instead, it leaves impressions. A flood remembered across civilizations. Humans shaped from Earth. Sacred knowledge guarded carefully. Cities built around divine order. Kingship descending from heaven. A species aware of death, while endlessly searching for permanence. These ideas survive because they still feel strangely close to modern life. Humanity continues building fragile systems against chaos. People still seek hidden truths beneath ordinary existence. They still fear collapse while longing for meaning beyond survival. The ancient world may be distant in time, but emotionally it remains near. And perhaps that is the final whisper Mesopotamia leaves behind. The oldest story of mankind was never fully lost. It scattered into fragments, changing shape as civilizations carried it forward through centuries of memory and transformation. Some parts survived in sacred texts, some remained buried in ruins, some continued quietly inside the human mind itself. Maybe that is why the ruins still call to people, not because they offer perfect answers, but because they preserve the feeling that something important waits beneath the surface of history. Something unfinished. Something half-remembered, a forgotten conversation between humanity and the mystery surrounding its own existence. And somewhere beneath the dust of ancient Mesopotamia, beneath broken tablets and silent cities, the story waits patiently in the clay, unfinished, but alive enough to keep whispering through history, long after the voices that first told it had disappeared into time forever, beyond human reach and memory. Good night,